Open and ask Naomi to do it.
I'll just have a karakia so that we fulfil our ambitions for today as part of a long, ongoing adventure. He te atua, tēnei ataho mai tō wairua ara taki hei whakakahi a mātou ki atu tuki pai te kaupapa I rongi te wai Māori, I rongi tō mātou rohi whānui tonu, ake ake, āmeni.
Āmeni. Kia ora.
In terms of notices, lunch is supplied at 1 o'clock for those that will still be here. I'll also make a note that we are being streamed now live, so please keep that in mind. Call for apologies, please. Okay, that's excellent. Any conflicts of interest to be declared? If not, confirmation of the Hawke's Bay drinking water governance minutes from the 10th of May. They've been previously circulated, so would someone like to move? Second. Thank you. Sorry, I just would make the point there's 3 councillors from Hastings sitting at the table, but only 2 will be able to vote. So Simon,
yeah, no, that's right.
That.
We know that.
You know, little line through you. So. Confirmation of the Māori representative, which is Naomi. This group just acknowledged that appointment's been made.
Right.
Yes. Now, we've also got guests today, and so welcome Jim. And you're also a colleague, I think, sitting at the back. But Jim presented to the Water Forum, to the Local Government Forum on water that was held in Wellington about 2 months ago, and I thought it was appropriate that perhaps he do the same presentation here. For those that have seen it already, I apologise, but I think it's important for everybody because it does set the scene for where drinking water standards and the other issues around water and water quality are currently sitting, and there's quite a few challenges in that area. So I'll actually pass over to Jim. You've seen his bio, it's been distributed. So Jim, it's over to you.
Great. Thanks, Garth. Garth introduced me. I'm Jim Graham. And just very briefly, my background's public health and water quality and public health and the effects of the link between water quality and illness. I work for Water New Zealand. I'm a principal water quality advisor there. I've spent 9 years. I've been with Water New Zealand for a year. Prior to that, I spent 9 years with a big consulting company working on drinking water supplies and might turn them off.
They're automatic.
Oh, are they? Okay. Working in the area of water supply and risk. And prior to that, I was with the Ministry of Health for 3 years, and I worked on the legislation, the Health Drinking Water Amendment Act, and I worked on the Drinking Water Standards, 2008 Drinking Water Standard, and a subsidy program that the Ministry ran at the time. Before that, I was a Drinking Water Assessor and Health Protection Officer. So all of those things have been around the same thing of water and water quality. Again, as Garth has done, I'll just apologise to people who've seen this presentation before. There's a couple of things I want to do. And I mean, you're probably the most familiar people in the country with the events almost 2 years ago to the day in Havelock North. So it's kind of significant, sort of an anniversary. And I'm not going to talk about that event, but one particular thing about that event has really interested me. And it's this question of how much. When I say how much, I'm thinking of how much. So we had more than 6,000 people ill at last count, I think, and some very unfortunate deaths. And the question that came to me was, how much sheep faeces makes that many people ill? Do you need because we know that the stream was contaminated with sheep faeces from a paddock there, and it contaminated the aquifer, and we know that happened. But how much sheep faeces had to get into that aquifer to make that many people ill? You know, was it a wheelbarrow full? Was it a? Do you need a truckload? Do you need will a bucket full do? And I just wondered about that question, and I thought about it quite a while. And then I thought, well, actually, you could probably figure it out. So I had a crack at figuring it out because I thought it was an interesting little exercise. And so if you're going to figure it out, the first thing you need to do is find out what's what we call an infective dose, and that is how many individual Campylobacter organisms are going to make a person sick. How many individual organisms make a person sick. So I had a look at the literature, and it actually depends on the strain of Campylobacter you're talking about. So for example, there's a strain of Campylobacter that lives on pakekos, and if humans consume those that strain of Campylobacter, they don't get ill at all. They don't get ill at all. Those ones don't make people sick. And there's other strains that are very, very brilliant, and as many as 10 organisms will make someone sick. But I took a bit of a look, and in general it seemed like there was about 50. So if you eat something that's got Campylobacter on it and you consume 50 Campylobacter bacteria, then that's enough to probably give you an illness, a terrible illness, Campylobacteriosis. So the next step then is to say, well, how many bacteria do you need then make 5,500 people ill? That's the figure I was working with at the time. How many individual bacteria do you need? And you just do a simple bit of calculation there and you come up with 275,000. So we need 275,000, but, and you'll be thinking about this, I'm sure, if you have 275,000 bacteria in your water supply, not all of that water is consumed by drinking. In fact, most of it isn't. So what I did was I said, well, let's take a factor of 1% of the water consumed as drinking water. So we'll times that number by 100, and we can say that more or less 27 million, 27.5 million. So we're looking for 27.5 million individual bacteria. This is a kind of a perfect kind of case scenario in many respects. So we need 27.5 million bacteria. They get in the wrong place, you've got 5,500 people ill. That's the equation. I thought about that and I said, well, that's kind of interesting. Where would you find 27.5 million bacteria? How much sheep faeces would you need for 27.5 million bacteria? So we keep going and we see that actually in the literature I found out there's probably about 500,000 Campylobacter organisms per gram of sheep faeces. So you just keep going and you end up saying, actually we need 55 grams of faeces or 11 teaspoons of sheep faeces to make 5,500 people. It's about an egg cupful. An egg cupful. I was quite stunned about that because I thought just one egg cupful of sheep poo could potentially make 5,500 people ill. I was a bit staggered at that result because I thought of it like this. Let's say I'm standing on the top of one of your reservoirs or one of your water supplies. I've got an egg cup full of a substance. And I say to you, this water supply, I'm going to tip this egg cup full of this substance into this whole huge big reservoir, and it's going to make 5,500 people ill. And I'm sure you'd be thinking, well, that egg cup full must be a very, very toxic substance. Very toxic substance. So let's say it was arsenic. Let's say I had an egg cup full of arsenic and I was going to tip that arsenic into that reservoir. How many people would get ill? In actual fact, nobody would become ill. There's such a big dilution factor that arsenic would be diluted to a dilution that was only barely detectable, and you wouldn't have any illness. So let's say, think of something else. So what's current at the moment? A lot of talk about 1080. Let's say I had an egg cup of 1080 poison there, and I was going to tip that into the reservoir. How many people would that make ill? Again, it's zero. It's absolutely none. It's absolutely none. Firstly, because as soon as that 1080 hits that water, it changes. It changes its form and it changes to something that's not particularly toxic. But even to find the residual of that 1080 poison in the water would be very difficult to find. So let's think of something else. Let's think of something that's really, really toxic. Let's say I had an egg cup full of pure sodium cyanide. I'm standing there, I'm going to tip that egg cup full of cyanide straight in that reservoir. How many people would get ill then? Again, you'd barely detect the cyanide. You'd barely be able to detect it. The dilution factor is so great. But, and here's the thing that's really curious, if I tip that egg cup full of sheep faeces into the reservoir, there's a potential to make a huge number of people ill. And I thought that's a very curious way of looking at it, very curious situation. And the difference is that the sheep faeces contains living organisms, bacteria. And those bacteria You just get 50 of them, which is not many, ingested into a person that causes illness. Now, I don't want to ignite any debate about chlorine and that question, but I would say that if that water had a residual of chlorine in it at 0.2 parts per million, which is hardly any, and I tipped that cup full of sheep faeces into that reservoir, how many illnesses would I get then? Absolutely zero. Absolutely zero. Because that chlorine is sufficient to kill off all those bacteria that are in that sheep faeces. But there's an interesting point about this. Let's say I change that cup full of sheep faeces to cattle faeces. I went to a dairy farm and I got some cattle faeces, and the water's still chlorinated, and I tipped it in there. How many cases of illness would I get then? And the interesting thing is, probably quite a few. Now, they wouldn't be Campylobacter, because chlorine would kill them. But there's another organism called Cryptosporidium that you find with cattle, and that organism is resistant to chlorine, and that organism would continue on and cause illness. And you might think, well, if the cattle faeces can cause illnesses of Cryptosporidium, even with the chlorine, why doesn't the sheep faeces do that as well? And the interesting thing about this is that the organism, we're going to talk about them a little bit later, called protozoa, that we find in the cattle faeces, you do actually find them, Giardia and Cryptosporidium, in the sheep faeces. But again, the strain that you find doesn't really cause illness in humans. It's unlikely to cause illness in humans. So there's a couple of questions and things that come up there. The first is the quantity of faeces of an animal that you need to cause widespread illness is just tiny. Just tiny. But it depends on the organism and the strain of organism and the type of organism. I took my little how much question a little bit further, and I said, well, how much faeces is there out there? One cow produces as much as 16 people in terms of faeces. And I know this is kind of, it's not really a before lunch or a before morning tea kind of discussion, but persevere with me, stick with me on this. And one sheep produces as much as 10 people. So if you add up how many dairy cows there are in New Zealand, how many beef cattle, how many sheep, you find this, what I think is an extraordinary figure. It's equivalent to the faeces of 464 million people. So we've got a population of 4 million people in New Zealand, but we've got an equivalent faeces load from our animals of 464 million people. I thought that's extraordinary. That's absolutely extraordinary. You can look at it another way. You can say, how many times does, and we'll just look at cattle, does a cow go to the toilet every day? 9 to 16 times on average. I'm sure you're really interested to know that. On average 12. 2 kilograms per defecation. Total output of 25 kilograms per cow per day. Excellent. 9 million cattle in New Zealand, 23,000 tonnes of faecal material per day. Add that up, and that's not even counting the sheep. 84 million tonnes a year. 84 million tonnes a year of cattle faeces in New Zealand. So I thought, well, that's kind of extraordinary. That's kind of extraordinary because if you compare the two, 84 million tonnes, 1 egg cupful, you can see that we have the potential to have quite a big problem here. We have quite a big problem potential if even a small quantity of that animal faeces gets into our water supply. Well, why is it important? The UN has these Sustainable Development Goals, and one of the key ones is reducing open defecation. And the reason you want to reduce open defecation is so that's people going to the toilet without a toilet, and you'd be surprised how many people do that in the world, and particularly not in New Zealand. We say that's great because they don't do New Zealand. Why is that important? Because if you have open defecation, you have the risk of that faeces getting into our waterways and affecting our waterways and the water that we drink. And so it's really important. And so we don't have open defecation in New Zealand for people, but our animals, they do it all the time. And so we have this question of what's happening with animals in our environment and their faeces. And keep that little egg cup idea in mind. So if any of you, and I'm sure many of you have been to a dairy farm, for example, in Waikato or the Taranaki or wherever, and it's been pouring with rain, it's been raining all day, and you're sloshing around in your gumboots, you'll know that you'll see brown water flowing around on the ground. Where does that water go? Well, it flows downhill, and downhill means it ends up in our streams and in our waterways and in our lakes. That's a simple reality. It's a simple reality. And I know farmers doing lots of fencing and those kind of things, but the simple reality is that of that huge burden of faeces, a lot of it does end up in our waterways. And if it ends up in our waterways, it can end up in our drinking water supplies and in our groundwater. So the question is it the same though? Is it the same? And does that animal faeces make people sick? When I say is it the same, I mean, is that pile of animal faeces the same as the human faeces that I'm talking about? Does it have the same effect? And is it all making people sick? Now, you've probably seen this from the inquiry, and the inquiry looked at this question of how many people get sick in New Zealand from drinking water supply, and some people, there was work that said it was 18 to 34 or 35, and some people say it's 100,000. I've said this before, and you may have heard me say, I don't know how much it is. I don't know how much it is. But I know one thing about that figure, and that is it should not be any more than zero, because nobody should get sick from drinking a water supply. I'm going to go through this very quickly about the things that do make us sick from a water supply. And we categorise the contaminants in water supply as being microbiological, chemical and physical. And the ones I want to look at are the micro ones. And they have these groups, and the one is bacteria, so that's what I've been talking about with Campylobacter, viruses, protozoa, I mentioned that, Cryptosporidium, cyanobacteria, not so relevant in groundwater. And they're all notable, the first three anyway, because they cause gastroenteric illness, and I'm sure you've all had one. You know what it's like. You never want to get too far from the toilet if you've got a gastroenteric illness, and you feel really terrible for quite a while. And eventually you normally come right. Cyanobacteria is a little bit different, and I'll talk about that just briefly. So apologies again to anyone who's been through this with me, and I suspect most of you have. I'm going to go through a couple of things that I think are really important. So bacteria, so we're talking about typhoid, cholera, salmonella, Campylobacter, those kind of things, usually from an animal or human fecal source. Now that's important. That's really important. I'll show you why later. And they're killed by chlorine. They're inactivated by UV light. They're inactivated. They're not killed. But the UV light scrambles up their DNA and they can't reproduce. And it's the reproduction that causes illness. Now remember I said you needed 50 organisms, Campylobacter, to make you sick? And the reason that it's so problematic is it's not those 50 organisms that make you sick. It's when you swallow them and they get inside you and they just go party time. And they multiply, and they multiply and multiply in this exponential growth. And it's the fact that you only need a few and they multiply inside you that gives you the illness. And in many respects, that's what makes that little egg cup full of sheep faeces so dangerous in a water supply and different to those other kind of contaminants, because they're living organisms and they get inside you, and it's the multiplication that makes you ill. They're tiny, of course, absolutely tiny, 3,000 times on the head of a pin. You may have seen this before. New Zealand has a real problem with Campylobacteriosis. We've had these very high rates, and you see this graph here. The reason I show you this graph is not because of the numbers, it's to show you one thing. That is, in the study of what we call epidemiology, and that's epidemiology is the study of illness in populations, not with an individual, but in a population. And the thing about this graph in epidemiology is that if you can come up with an idea that intervenes in this illness cycle, you can reduce the number of cases. And so we saw this in New Zealand in 2007. People were very concerned about the number of Campylobacteriosis cases there are in New Zealand. We need to do something. We know that Campylobacter is associated with chickens. It lives on chickens. It just lives on chickens, all over them, on their skin, in their feathers. Doesn't make them sick. That's the thing about Campylobacter. This particular one, Campylobacter jejuni, doesn't make them sick, makes us sick. In the same way that we have bacteria living all over our body, Staphylococcus aureus doesn't make us sick. In fact, it's quite a good thing. It can only make you ill if it gets in a cut, and sometimes you get an infection. But normally it's fine. So there's interventions around the use and handling of poultry. And what this graph shows is if you make those interventions, you can seriously reduce the burden of disease, the number of people who get sick. So that's a really important lesson for us in public health. And it's one of the things about public health that we try to do in public health is try and look at ways that we can reduce illness. And drinking water is a public health measure. And the reason we have drinking water supplies is to reduce illness. It goes right back to those cholera outbreaks in the mid-1800s. So, how well are we doing? Well, actually not that well. Not that well, unfortunately. Campylobacter has been plaguing New Zealand water supplies for a long time. And we're trying to get on top of it. And we have been successful in some respects, but not in others. So, bacteria and Campylobacter are problematic. There's one bacteria that's really special. We call it E. coli, Escherichia coli. And Escherichia coli is a bacteria that lives in the gut of a mammal in huge numbers. And it breaks down our food. It's a busy little guy, does a fantastic job. And the reason it's important is we use it in water supplies. And what we do with E. coli is we test for it. And if we find E. coli in water, we say, well, actually, that E. coli has come from the gut of a mammal. And if that E. coli is in that water, then some of those other organisms that could make people sick, they could well be there as well. Now, E. coli doesn't make us sick, generally. Generally, it doesn't make us sick. Most E. coli are fine, because they live inside us, so if they made us sick, we'd be sick all the time. So generally, E. coli is fine. But if we find it in water, that tells us that water is contaminated with feces from a mammal, and those other guys, Campylobacter, etc., could be there. And so we test, and drinking water standards are based around E. coli, and we test for E. coli as that indicator. We call it indicator organism. And while I said it doesn't make you sick, I'm actually not quite right about that. There's a particular strain, in fact there's several strains that do cause illness, and they've got what's called a virulence gene. So this guy, E. coli 0157, turned up around the mid-80s with this virulence gene, and it produces a toxin which causes kidney damage, and it's been responsible for deaths and different waterborne outbreaks. It's a very dangerous organism to have in a water supply because it has these terrible effects. I'm going to talk about E. coli a little bit more later. I want to get moving through some of these others, but before I do, E. coli 0157 cases in New Zealand. We used to have no cases. I remember in Auckland in the late 90s investigating what was one of the first cases of E. coli 0157. I was working as a protection officer with a family who were living in a farming area, and I investigated them because their kid had this illness, survived, and I went and had a chat with them, and I found they were taking their water out of a stream, and that stream was running through a paddock, and in that paddock was some cattle. We know that E. coli 0157 is associated with cattle, and it was pretty easy to figure out where they got it from. And it was pretty easy to then put into place some intervention, some public health intervention, to improve their water supply to prevent that from happening again. The reason I show you this graph is this. Key thing is E. coli 0157 is associated with cattle. And we've got this increasing number of cases. Now, not all of those cases will be waterborne. Many of those cases will be actually to do with food. But the fact is the graph increases. And what happens is it starts to increase from about 2009. What else happened in New Zealand from that time? We had a significant increase in the number of cattle in New Zealand. And the reason I show this graph is simply to show that there's a link between the animals we have in our environment and illness. In this case, I think it shows us that link. Now, I can't say that this is a causal link. All I can say is there is an association between those two things. But I think it's significant because what it says is if you have more animals, you have a greater level of risk. I want to look very quickly at this other guy, protozoa. So these are also associated with cattle, and this is why I said if you had chlorine in the water and you tipped sheep faeces in, you wouldn't expect to get illnesses, but if you tipped cattle faeces in, you would expect to get illnesses, because these guys are resistant to chlorine, completely resistant to chlorine, cryptosporidiosis. If you're going to control them chlorine, you need to have a high dose of chlorine over a long period of time. That's because when they live in the environment, and that would be in natural water, they just have this little packet of DNA, and it lives in this little thing like a little tiny golf ball with a hard shield, waxy shield around it. And the chlorine can't penetrate that to kill them. And then when you swallow them, again, they get inside, they do this thing where they change into these really awesome looking organisms there, little trophozoites, and they multiply, and it's those guys make you sick. But the key thing, and this is a really important point, is that these organisms are not controlled by chlorine. So chlorine alone in a water supply isn't necessarily going to be enough to prevent illness. They are inactivated by UV, and what that means, same thing, they stay alive, but they can't multiply. They can't do that multiplying thing. No medical treatment for cryptosporidiosis. You get it, you've got to get well yourself, and most people do, but if you're immune compromised, that'll be very, very difficult, and we do have deaths associated with cryptosporidiosis with immune compromised people. New Zealand has very high rates of cryptosporidiosis and giardiasis, which is another protozoa organism. And so you can see our rates there per 1,000 people, 23.8 and 32.9 for crypto and giardia. And you can see they're much lesser rates for other countries. Why? We have so many animals per person. You know, we're an agrarian economy. We have a lot of animals. And those numbers of animals are linked to our illness rates in this respect. And one of the most critical pathways is water supply. There's an interesting thing though about this, and that is that we have these seasonal patterns with cryptosporidiosis and giardiasis. And so with cryptosporidiosis, you get this peak around September, around spring. Why? Well, that's when calves are born. And calves are very susceptible to cryptosporidiosis, very susceptible. So suddenly you get more calves, you've got all these calves, they are susceptible, they become infected very easy, and you have more cryptosporidiosis available for people to have contact with. And like I said, it's not all waterborne, but a lot of it is. In fact, a lot of these are associated with calf day at schools, and they're contracted directly from the calves. And so kids, you know, oh, so great, oh, can I pat your calf? Yeah, what's that? Oh, don't worry about that. Here, have a sandwich. Yum, that's great. And you can't taste them. As far as I know, you can't taste them, but you get this direct contact as well. And it attributes for quite a bit of that peak. I suspect some of that peak is also determined by our contamination of water. There's a little interesting point that I'll make here as well. And again, this is this question about these different species, because different species are very relevant. So Cryptosporidium and giardiasis again, and you see here that the cases that we find in swimming pools, and swimming pools are a very common infection route for cryptosporidiosis. Very common infection route. And I've been involved in public health investigating some huge outbreaks. We had one in Wellington when I was working in the early 2000s, and it just went on and on and on, because kids would get crypto, they get this diarrhea, they get vomiting, and they think they were all right, and they want to get back to the pool and go to school and have these swimming lessons, and it was in a big public pool they'd be held, and they'd been swimming along, and whoops, and there'd be a kid swimming along behind them, and they got their mouth open and water getting in, and we just couldn't stop this reinfection. And in the end, as a health protection officer, we had to end up closing. I think we closed 5 public swimming pools to stop the spread and stop the outbreak. And eventually that was the only way we could do it, and eventually it stopped it because people didn't have contact. But it was a pretty drastic measure. So for swimming pools, you find it's this one, hominis, Cryptosporidium hominis. But associated with animals, it's Cryptosporidium parvum. And the important thing is that the species that infects cattle is different from the one that normally infects humans, but both can make you ill. So Just check where I'm up to. The next thing I want to talk about then is viruses, and just very quickly, viruses are a whole different kettle of fish altogether. There's an argument about whether it's a living organism at all, because it's just a tiny little packet of genetic material, and what it does is it lands on a cell and injects that, and they're very cell specific. They can't just go to any cell. They have particular cells that they match up with. They kind of have what we call agglutinins, and they only attach to certain cells. And they inject their own RNA into the cell, and the cell's busy doing its business, making proteins or making whatever it does, and it replicates a particular DNA strand to make whatever it's doing, its job is. And the virus just injects its own RNA and DNA into that cell, and the cell just starts replicating it. And so the cell ends up making the virus, and then it gets so many it collapses, and all these new virus particles come out, and they go looking for another cell of the right type. So the thing that's interesting and curious about this debate is it's considered you can only be called an organism, a living organism, if you can reproduce by yourself with your own species. But viruses don't. They have to have a host cell that reproduces for them. So that debate. They're tiny. They're really tiny. An example is hepatitis A. There's a whole bunch of them. They're thought to be killed by chlorine, thought to be controlled by chlorine, but they're not very well controlled by UV. In fact, to control viruses, to use a UV system that we currently use in water supplies, if you want it to do viruses as well, you've got to have the dose rate ramped up way, way higher than we'd ever use for water supply. So UV doesn't control them, and they can survive for very long periods in groundwater. So we used to think that when we wrote the drinking water standards in 2008, we thought that was a year. That's why we had that secure bore water criteria. So water's been underground for a year. You don't have to worry about any organisms in it or anything that could make you sick, because it will have died off. But the evidence now is it's probably 2 years or even more for some viruses. And the other evidence is we found they go way further than we ever thought they would go in groundwater. So our science, our knowledge is changing about these guys. Very important viruses. The question is, are they all the same? And I've talked about strains and different species and different organisms. And the reason it's important is this. This is a really important thing to note. Humans, human feces, contains bacteria, protozoa, and viruses. Okay? And cattle, cows, sheep, they contain bacteria and protozoa that can make humans ill. Most viruses are species specific. Not all. Most viruses are species specific. And I think probably our enteric ones are. So we don't catch viruses from cows and cattle and sheep. We catch them from other humans. There's some viruses that infect different species. So rabies is a good example. Rabies is a virus that affects animals, but also if the animal bites you, then it can infect people. But generally our enteric viruses, we think, are pretty species specific. And so then, if you've got bacterial organisms, you can control them with UV or chlorine. If you've got protozoa, you can use UV, but not chlorine. And if you've got viruses, you can use chlorine, but not UV. And this is what we talk about with water supply. We talk about the multi-barrier approach. And you might have heard that. What we're saying is you need to have a number of barriers. And one of those reasons for having a number of barriers is because not all barriers work with all contaminants. Not all barriers work with all microorganisms. And so many water supplies will have UV and chlorine. But if you can be confident, for example, that you have a water source that doesn't have human feces in it, but might have cattle and sheep, then you can be confident you're very unlikely to have viruses. And so you might find that your water supply, let me get this right, you've got bacteria and protozoa, you'll need both. You'll need both. Yep, bacteria and protozoa. You'll need both UV and chlorine. The other thing that comes into this is, it's a little bit of an aside, but groundwater has been shown to generally not be contaminated with protozoa. Groundwater is generally not contaminated with protozoa because they're so big they get filtered out really easily. And I guess the point I'm making is that when you look at, and I know that you're doing this, when you look at water supply, you've got to have a really good understanding of what are the contaminants in your catchment. We don't do that very well in New Zealand. I know you people have been doing quite a bit of work on it. We historically have said in New Zealand, we'll take whatever we can get and then we'll concentrate on the treatment processes. What we find overseas, this is British Columbia where I've been recently, what we find is they do comprehensive assessments. And this is a guidance document for determining groundwater at risk of containing pathogens. Groundwater at risk of pathogens, a GARP, and all water suppliers are required to do this assessment of their source water so they know what pathogens and contaminants are going to be there, and then they know what kind of treatment processes they have. They do another one called a quantitative risk assessment, a QMRA, and that's a mathematical assessment of the number of particular pathogens you might have at a water source. Very important. I just want to go back to E. coli. And I won't dwell on this too much because we put a lot of store in E. coli. We always have for a long time. It's been this holy grail of water supply. And we use it because if we do a test and we find E. coli is present, we say, well, if it's present, then we know that those other microorganisms could be present. Your Campylobacter, your protozoa, whatever it might be. The problem with that is this. If it's not present, what does that tell us? Because we make a whole lot of assumptions. We do a test and we make a whole lot of assumptions. So let's say we do a test on Tuesday and we get a not present for E. coli and we do another test on the following Tuesday. We assume that it was never there between those two Tuesdays. That's the assumption we make. Okay. So I wonder about that assumption. But also, if we get a negative result for E. coli, we assume that protozoa aren't present. We assume that bacteria, other bacteria like Campylobacter aren't present. And we assume that viruses aren't present. And I wonder if that's sensible. Because I've just told you that viruses can survive for up to 2 years or possibly more in groundwater. E. coli will never last that long. It'll never last that long. E. coli has quite a short lifespan in the environment. Once it's outside a host, it doesn't live a heck of a long. And your protozoa forms that little golf ball-like thing of genetic material that can last quite a long time in the environment as well. And when it does that, it can live for, or remain viable and wait for a host and turn back into that trophozoa once it's swallowed. But E. coli doesn't do that. It doesn't have that capacity. So I have a lot of concern about the amount of faith we put in our negative tests for E. coli. We make this assumption that if E. coli is not present, nothing else is present. And I wonder if we need to think about that in terms of our drinking water standards into the future and other ways we look at determining whether water is safe or not. Very quickly, cyanobacteria, it's kind of a cross between bacteria and protozoa, bacteria and algae, sorry. And it contaminates, it grows like a bloom, and it some of them contain toxins some of the time, and some of them don't have toxins other times. And those toxins can cause considerable physiological effects. They can be neurotoxins, they can be liver toxins, they can affect your breathing, and they've been really problematic. And you know, every year in the Hutt Valley, we get, in summer, we get cyanobacteria growing on the rocks in the Hutt River. And people say, the council says, don't take your dog down the Hutt River. Dogs are particularly susceptible to these toxins. Dog goes in the water, comes out, licks its paw, licks its hand. Dogs don't have hands, licks its leg or its paw. And that's enough for that toxin because they're so susceptible for the dog to be very seriously affected and generally causes death. So we have to be very careful when we're using surface waters of looking for these things. And over the years, I've had more and more people every spring and summer. I have more people contact me saying, "I've got this new thing, Jim. We've got this kind of a strange algae-looking thing growing in our raw water pond or in our stream. We haven't seen it before." And so we're seeing more and more cyanobacteria, and for a number of reasons. One, it uses the nutrients that are in the water, and we have this growing problem with nutrients. But also, it likes warm water. And you've all heard about climate change and our water getting warmer and warmer, and I think that's a factor as well. So that's our microorganisms and that link to animals. And remember that stunning fact that I think is just quite extraordinary, that a tiny quantity of faeces can cause quite a huge number of illnesses. There's just a couple of other things I want to talk about, and I'll try and get through them relatively quickly. I know you've got a lot to do. I want to talk about nitrogen. And you will have heard about nitrogen a lot. We hear about it in an environmental sense. So nitrogen comes from three main sources. One is wastewater, one is fertiliser, and the other is the urine of cattle. Okay, and I'm not down on cattle, don't get the wrong idea, I'm not down on cattle, but they are a source of a lot of contaminants in our environment. And the reason that cattle are problematic is, I mean, if you've ever seen a cow go to the toilet, again, this is not much of a conversation, but I'm always staggered by the quantity of urine that a cattle beast produces. And that's the problem, the quantity. Because if you put urine, which has got nitrogen in it, onto grass, the grass goes, "I love this," loves the nitrogen, helps it grow, so it absorbs that nitrogen. But if you have a whole lot of urine from a cow in one spot, it's called a urine patch, the grass can't use all of that nitrogen, and some of it passes through and into the groundwater. And that's the problem with cattle and nitrogen. So that nitrogen gets in groundwater, can end up in our waterways, and it produces growth of algae and green stuff, and we call that eutrophication. You get too much nitrogen. And I know you've had this thing with the dam recently, and the big question was it would increase the number of animals that could be on the land, and there was a nitrogen limiting factor there. So nitrogen's important, but what a lot of people don't realise is that nitrogen has a direct effect on human health as well. And so nitrogen, if you have a bore into that water that's got high levels of nitrogen, and you abstract that water, that nitrogen can have an adverse effect on the health, particularly of babies. And it's kind of a curious thing, and I found it quite interesting, that if adults drink water with nitrogen in it, it doesn't have the same adverse effect. And we call it blue baby syndrome. There's a whole lot of blue baby syndromes. There's a whole lot of bunch of things, I think 5 or 6, that make babies go blue. And it's a lack of oxygen. But nitrogen is one of them. So nitrate is biologically inert. What happens is, if you have a whole lot of nitrogen as nitrate in groundwater, and you abstract it in a water supply, and you feed that water to a baby, and it's over a certain level, that nitrate, the microflora, that's the gut bacteria, they change that inert nitrate into nitrite. And it's the nitrite that is the problem, because it converts hemoglobin into methemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is to do with the oxygen transport, and it's in your blood. And the hemoglobin absorbs the oxygen. And if you have nitrate, it interferes with that process. And what happens with babies is the methemoglobin blocks that uptake of oxygen. That's why they go blue, because they can't get any oxygen. And so it's nitrate levels above what we call the maximum acceptable value in drinking water standards is very dangerous for young infants, young children, and women who are pregnant. So we have this focus on nitrate as an environmental issue, but it's actually a public health issue too, because it can have a direct effect on these young. It doesn't affect adults in the same way, because the nitrate is absorbed before it reaches your gut flora, and so it doesn't get converted to nitrite. And there's a couple of places down in Canterbury where levels of nitrate in groundwater has got so high that from time to time the medical officer of health issues an alert, and people who have babies, they can't feed that water to those babies, and they have to have bottled water and that kind of thing. It's quite a alarming situation. And the problem with nitrate in groundwater is it doesn't just, so arsenic or boron, it gets to a level and pretty much every test you do will be the same. Nitrate tends to fluctuate and go up and down, so you've got to monitor it quite carefully. The last thing I want to talk to you about today is this emerging issue that we're seeing, and it's gotten not a lot of coverage in New Zealand, but it's getting quite significant in overseas, particularly in the US. And we call it contaminants of emerging concern. There's a whole range of them. And I know, for example, a water supply in New Zealand that has recently identified a contaminant called bisphenol A, which is a plasticizer. And it's found that in its groundwater supply. Now, bisphenol A is a pretty toxic substance. It's in very low levels, but it was introduced to New Zealand in 1947 as an industrial chemical, and it's been used. And what's happened is it's been used in an area. It's clearly got onto the ground. It's got into the groundwater. And if you'd said to me, should we test our water for bisphenol A? I would have said no. You'll never find that. I wouldn't expect to find that. But somebody did, and guess what? They found it. And so that is an indication of these kind of new things that are coming along. And a lot of things, if you look, on PFOS and all of that kind of question we've seen with those foams. So what I want to talk about, though, is one that is a group of them called endocrine disruptors. So endocrine disruptors are substances that mimic or interfere with the function of hormones in the body. And so there's some naturally occurring ones like arsenic, triclosan, which is in your toothpaste. It's been banned in toothpastes overseas, but it's still in toothpaste in New Zealand. Not quite sure why. There's a lot of agrochemicals, industrial polymers, things in cosmetics, things in sunscreen, contraceptive pills, and plasticizers and plastic bottles. So they're kind of all over the place. And the problem with endocrine disruptors, and the reason that they are important, is that endocrines in our body do a whole range of functions. They have a whole range of functions associated with metabolism, growth, reproduction, sleep, mood, all sorts of things. And the endocrine system produces hormones. The thing about it is that those hormones operate in extraordinarily tiny quantities, to do these kind of things, and they regulate and control things in our body. That's why they're important to us. And so they have these effects at very low doses, and they have a wide range of effects because it controls so much of our body. And so often the effects of things that disrupt those endocrine processes, you don't see for quite a long time after a long period of exposure. The other problem is that they're all over the place. They're absolutely everywhere, these chemicals. They're in our waterways. They're all sorts of places. We have a growing use of pharmaceuticals that are to do with things that control and affect our hormones and our endocrine system. And there's a suggestion that it could affect DNA. So what effect can they have? Well, there's a potential for things that disrupt our endocrine systems to affect our immune systems, our processes and metabolic processes, brain behaviour, a whole bunch of things there. And of course, fertility and reproductive systems. So, if we have all those things going on, suddenly endocrine disrupting chemicals become quite a problem. And where have we seen effects? Well, people say that there's possible things to do with animals in the environment. So we see these changes with frogs, and it's considered to be linked to, one of the things it's linked to is endocrine disrupting chemicals. So these are the claims that people make. And so frogs, for example, growing extra legs or changing their sex and those kind of things. So it has the potential to be quite problematic. And in humans, now this is not known to be the case, but this is claims that people have made, that scientists have been looking at. And so people are suggesting that maybe there's endocrine disruptors have an influence in some cancers, ectopic pregnancies. People are saying, well, given that endocrine disruptors can affect and there's a lot of endocrine involvement or hormone involvement in reproductive systems, doubling in cases of cryptorchidism, so that's to do with the lack of development of the testicles in young boys, and a decrease in sperm count. So I'm not saying the endocrine disruptive chemicals are causing these things. What I'm saying is people have suggested that there might be a link, and there's a fair amount of research going on into that question. So why is it important, and why am I raising it? And bearing in mind that this is just one of these things of emerging concern. Well, where would you find these endocrine disrupting chemicals? You'd find them in human wastewater. In human wastewater, pharmaceuticals, your toothpaste, etc. It all goes down the drain. And it goes through our wastewater treatment plants, and it comes out in the discharges that our wastewater treatment plants use. Where do our wastewater treatment plants discharge? All over the place. They discharge to land, and particularly we have a situation where all down the Waikato River there's discharges of wastewater. What else do we do with the Waikato River? We use it for a source of water supply.
Send it to Auckland.
And so we are sucking that water out of that river. And the reason it's significant and causing so much concern in many other countries is people are saying, is this a problem? And when I raise this question of endocrine disrupting chemicals and these contaminants of emerging concern, the reason I raise it is to say this. Is this a problem? I'm not saying this is a problem, I'm saying, is this a problem? And a lot of people are starting to say, we need to do a lot more research on this question. We need to have a greater understanding of the chemicals that we use in the environment and the effects they might have on us. Because we're seeing some of those effects and we're not understanding why they are occurring. So I raise this because people say to me, what's on the horizon? What's on the future for us? And I say, well, there's a bunch of things we need to start thinking about. And contaminants of emerging concern is one of them, and I think endocrine disrupting chemicals is certainly at the top of that list. Potential. So just then to finish up, some takeaway messages. Going back to the beginning, pathogens are highly prevalent in our environment associated with livestock in New Zealand. And they're easily accessible because of that open defecation question. Surface waters are frequently contaminated with animal and bird associated pathogens, and the amount of those pathogens that we need to make huge numbers of people sick is extraordinarily tiny. It's extraordinarily tiny. And when I did that little mathematical exercise, I was staggered to find out that the quantity of sheep feces to make so many people sick was so small. And just to go back to that, I'm not saying that that was the amount that got into the aquifer in Havelock North. I'm not saying that was the amount. I suspect it was way more. It's just a theoretical mathematical exercise to make my point. There's a clear link between human health and animal feces and human illness and water as a pathway, and there's a whole bunch of emerging concerns, contaminants of emerging concern out there that we need to have our eye on in the future, and endocrine disrupting chemicals is one of them. Thank you very much. You've been very patient, very, very good listeners. And if we've got time, Garth, if there's any questions at all,
the intent was certainly to provide an open forum for Q&A. So
I noticed no one has been drinking their water.
I'm sure it's fine. It's probably the peppermints that are more of a problem for you.
Can I just ask Jim, I'll just kick off with one. Obviously, one of the things that the work this group has been doing and overseeing in the joint working group as well is a multi-barrier approach. And obviously you've referred to that in terms of UV and chlorine. One of the issues that we're looking at is source protection zones, which is really topical at the moment. How do you see those fitting into this wider multi-barrier approach? and what goes on in them, because currently there's most probably sheep farming or orchardists working in those areas. So how do you see that sort of evolving, and is there any overseas sort of precedents in these areas to exclude like sheep farming or cattle farming in source protection zones, or how far do they go overseas?
So that's a really good question. So the first thing I'd say in terms of the multi-barrier, source protection is what we call a first barrier. It's the first barrier, and we do very little of it in New Zealand, but it should be the very first barrier. And so source protection is barrier number one. And I think in New Zealand we should do a whole lot more work in that. We don't do much. Overseas, yes, they do. They do a huge amount of work in barrier protection. So for example, you could take New York City. And so what they've done in New York City, they used to have a water supply. So a lot of water supplies in North America, what they do is they collect water into these huge raw water reservoirs that are open reservoirs, and they use that water with chlorine only. And the approach they take is they say we'll only need to be using chlorine if we have a big program to prevent any of those other contaminants getting into that source water, which is source water protection. And New York is a good example. There's a really good case in Victoria, in Victoria in Vancouver Island, which I've seen. And so they buy up the land. They buy all the land of the catchment, and they prevent any stock being in there. They prevent any human access. There's no people living there, those kind of things. If you look at New York, they couldn't buy the land for the catchment, it's quite large, but they paid for, the Water Corporation paid for a wastewater system to remove all of the on-site septic tank systems. And they removed all the on-site septic tank systems and collected that wastewater and treated it and discharged it out of the catchment. And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking. If you look at the Netherlands, it's a really good example, and it's where they do use water supplies without any treatment. And people say, well, why can't we have water supplies without chlorine? Because they do it in the Netherlands, they do it in Denmark. But what do they do in the Netherlands? The water supply owns all of the land that is the catchment for those groundwater bores. And they don't permit any people to be in there, they don't permit any stock in there. They remove all those sources of contaminants. So the simple answer is yes, really important, and yes, overseas you see there's quite significant effort into protecting those catchments and keeping them.
What do they do about birds?
Birds. The thing about birds is, and yes, you're right, so if you've got a groundwater supply, birds are less likely to be a problem, because birds are generally carry bacteria, and bacteria don't survive very long. If they if bird feces is on the ground, it tends to be the pathogens, bacterial pathogens die off in that first layer of soil. So you don't tend to see the bacterial pathogens from birds getting into groundwater. That's the first thing. The second thing is that birds are bacterial pathogens, and so chlorine controls them. So that's why they have chlorine in, for example, in Victoria, to control any of that bird pathogens that might be there. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
So Jim, in Holland, do they chlorinate their water? So why? I understand they protect the source,
Yeah.
but we're saying we can protect source, but the moment the water leaves source into the reticulation system, we're exposed.
Yes.
So how do they?
Yeah, so that's another really good question. So what they do in the Netherlands is they put a lot of effort into that source water protection, and then they put a huge amount of effort into protecting the water once it's in the network. And I'll give you an example, because they do the same in Denmark. So in Denmark, water losses, and water loss is a really strong indication of the integrity of your network. So water losses in Denmark are generally around 6%. In Denmark, if your water losses get to 10%, you get a fine. The regulator gives you a fine. They give you a fine. And in the Netherlands, water losses are around 3%, which is tiny. What's water loss in New Zealand?
20.
15, 20% you consider to doing a great job. So that's the first thing. And then within the network, they have backflow protection devices at every connection. Not just your swimming pools and your mortuaries and your factories, every connection. And then they have pressure sensing all across the network. So they put a big lot of effort into their renewals program. They're constantly making sure the pipes are in really good condition. And so, and people say to me, well, can you have a water supply without chlorine? And I always say to them, well, you must be able to do it because they do it successfully in those countries. Could we have it in New Zealand? Well, sure, we could. How much money are you prepared to spend? And you can say, put a whole lot of work into source water protection, a whole lot of work into your network, then yes, you might be able to do it. But at the moment, no one's there. And chlorine just becomes the cheaper, easier, safest option. So answer your question?
Yes. Question.
Thanks. Sorry, I tend to, once someone asks a question, I tend to...
Thank you, Garth. The endocrine disruptive chemicals you talked about right at the
Endocrine, yep.
Endocrine, whatever, yep. Are they, do they survive in the ground? Do they come through in the groundwater, or are they just ones that only survive in surface water?
No, you could find them in groundwater if the groundwater is contaminated with wastewater system, wonderful wastewater systems. Perfectly, yeah. They don't break down easily. They don't break down easily, and that's one of the problems with endocrine, with all those kind of chemical contaminants.
Given the diversity of those, I assume there's no single indicator as you would treat E. coli as an indicator?
No, you have to look for each one, really.
Separately.
You have to look for them, yeah. So don't get the wrong idea. I don't want to go away from here and all of you going, endocrine disruptors, they're going to a huge problem in our water supply. We're going to have to deal with this and do something about it. That's not what I want to leave you with. What I want to leave you with as an impression is there's things on the horizon that perhaps we just need to keep our eye on and be aware of. But don't go away thinking you've got a problem with endocrine disrupting chemicals. That's the last thing I want you to do. I just want you to be aware that there's a whole lot of new things out there. You're probably over dealing with Campylobacter and bacteria. You're probably sick of that.
Yeah.
And so the bad news is that there's other things to think about, but that's also the good news, because once you're on top of Campylobacter, you can think about some of these other things.
One of the challenges in water supply is when you take the test, to develop the outcome of that test takes 2 days or even 3, 4, 5 days before you get the result. Is there any technology or new testing that can reduce that time frame? Because in that time frame, you've pumped an awful lot of water before you know that you've got a problem. So the source protection and all the other barriers are very important. But is there any technology or new improvements in testing that actually speeds up that process, so you can know virtually instantaneously you've got a problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. Currently, no. Are we close? Yes, I think we are. There's a number of tests that look for markers. So there's a lot of work going on in a test called a tryptophan test. So tryptophan's a substance that's produced by living organisms, and it's a little bit easier to detect. And so they've got this tryptophan test which can give you a result in quite a short period of time, I think maybe 20 minutes, that people are working on and not fully perfected. There's other ones as well. The problem is that a lot of those tests are very useful where you've got a relatively high level of contamination and you've got a significant quantity of those things that you're looking for. But drinking water supply contamination, where you've got 8 or 10 bacteria in 100 mils of water, then your test has to have a really high level of sensitivity, and it's getting that level of sensitivity. So we've seen some of those tests that will work with wastewater, but not so useful with drinking water. I think it's probably only a matter of time, but I don't know what that time frame would be.
No.
Could you say more about the use of the source protection zones? Because it seems to me that those are conceived as very local. The assumption behind it is that the source of contaminant is very localized, and if you put a drinking water bore down there, you're asking for some problems. But if the aquifer is recharged,
Yes.
and by an enormous catchment called the Narrow River, and it's sheep and beef farmers kilometers away who have the beasts on their land.
Yes.
And the water in the aquifer is very transmissive.
No.
What's the point of a source protection zone?
No. So there's a couple of things there, and you're right. So your contaminant source might be a long way away, but and that's what I'm talking about. Those two systems, the GARP or the quantitative microbial risk assessment, because if it's a long way away, and your pathogen is bacteria or protozoa, they're unlikely to get to your source water because they don't survive that long. But if your source is going to have virus particles in it, and we know that viruses travel a long way and survive a long time, so that could be a problem. And so one of the things about source water protection it is just understanding what's out there and what the risks are. And so cattle in your source recharge zone, it's a long way away, may not be a problem if you can figure out what the transit time of that water is. But if you've got human wastewater discharges, that might be a problem. So that's the first thing, is when you do look at source water protection, is understand what contaminants are there to what might be affected. And then the next thing is you can't say, well, we're going to ban that farm, or we're going to, but you look at what things you might be able to do, and it might be to do with microbiological pathogens, but it might be to do with it might be to do with other contaminants. For example, nitrogen. So you might want to control the loading of fertilizer onto that land, and so we do this nitrogen budgeting for farms to protect against environmental contamination with nitrogen and nitrate. Maybe we should think about with that in terms of what things we might allow farmers to do if we're extracting groundwater. I think more and more as so if I use that problem with bisphenol A, so what that explains to us is that the activities that occurred in that catchment from 1947 to some point allowed that contaminant, which is a persistent contaminant, doesn't break down, to escape into the environment. And so the practices that were in place at the time in the catchment were unacceptable and not useful. So it's, can we control controls on practices and behaviours as well?
No, Naomi first and then Simon.
The E. coli, if they're a limited indicator organism, and GARP doesn't take account of nitrates in that, is there a comprehensive testing mechanism that can be engaged sooner rather than later, rather than theorising about it? Is there a regime that we can measure all those things?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And I think the thing to say is that the reason we use E. coli is because it's really cheap. It's really cheap and it's really easy, even though it gives you a limited amount of information. And I think that if you're going to protect a water source, you need to be doing more than one thing. And so a water supplier would look to do a suite of chemical tests, maybe every 12 months. That would give them an idea of the things that might change. But then if you look at your catchment and you say, well, we've got these particular activities, maybe we should be looking for another range of things. And so, for example, if you've got certain industries that use certain chemicals, and you know that they're historically been the case, or landfills, then you look for those particular things. It's more about, you have kind of universal indicators, but then you can target as well and have specific indicators. So protozoa is a classic case. We know that protozoa causes contamination when we have rainfall events. And so what we've tended to do with protozoa is we've tended to say, well, we'll take a sample every month. But actually, it's a much better idea to say, well, we'll take a intensive testing, over a 5-day period after we've had a 5-year rain event. So it's more matching your testing regime to your own circumstances.
Sorry, Simon.
Thanks. I'm interested in ranking in importance the things you've told us, but also trying to give it an importance rating as well. In other words, crucial, just keep an eye on it, that sort of thing.
Yep.
Can you do that?
Yeah, I can, and that's a fantastic question. It's a fantastic question, and it's a pretty simple answer, and it goes like this: the things that are the greatest concern are your microorganisms. Absolutely, your microorganisms, bacteria, protozoa, viruses, and the reason that they are the greatest concern is that they cause illness very rapidly in huge numbers of people. So we need to, in our first instance, consider those microorganisms. Number one in flashing lights, front and centre. The next things we need to think about are, and in those microorganisms, I'd also, if you're using surface waters, put cyanobacteria. We need to have a real eye open for cyanobacteria. The chemical contaminants, industrial chemical contaminants, we need to have an eye open, but most of those contaminants are what we cause chronic illness. In other words, you have to have exposure over a reasonable long period of time at the levels we find them in before you develop symptoms. So we need to have an eye on those things. The micro ones are what we call acute illness. You get it straight away really quickly and it's pretty bad. And then we just need to have a bit of a telescope into the future, what's coming at us, and that's those contaminants of emerging concern, like those endocrine disruptors. There's another one, nanoparticles. So nanotechnology is the big thing at the moment, and they're using, for example, nanoparticles to get pharmaceuticals into the body, and they go into your body and they lodge and distribute this pharmaceutical, but eventually they get discarded and excreted. And they're these tiny, tiny, tiny nanoparticles, you know, and we've just got to have a telescope on that and say, is this something that's going to be a problem in the future? So yeah, number one is those microbes, absolutely.
I thought that would be the answer.
Thanks very much.
Okay, I think time's at a point where we could close this, but again, thank you very much, Jim, on behalf of the group here. Appreciate you taking time. I know you've got a presentation later here this afternoon, I think it is, so again, appreciate your input and certainly the messages that you've been able to share today. So thank you very much. Thank you. So in terms of the recommendations, would someone like to move that the committee receives and notes the presentation from Jim?
I'll do that for you, Councillor.
Seconder? Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Cheers, Gary. Moving on to the next item on the agenda.
Thank you, Garth. Well, this is kind of topical now as an endocrine disruptor, but at the last meeting of the Joint Committee, we advised that there have been, over the course of the past couple of years, 3 incidences that our agencies are aware of high arsenic levels in drinking water supplies, and I do emphasise here that these are around self-supplies. They're not the municipal supplies, but rural areas and self-supplies. And the relevant TAs, twice it's been Hastings, once Napier, the Regional Council and the Drinking Water Assessor and the District Health Board have been involved in each of those cases. And one of the things that we found was an element of mixed messaging around the risk of ingestion of the water containing the arsenic. And so we suggested, and the committee approved at your last meeting, that we develop a protocol for how we would both action an incidence of arsenic in groundwater and also what the messaging would be. So attached to the paper, on page 9 of your agenda, is a draft protocol, and it's been put together by a working group from a subgroup from the Joint Drinking Water Group, and you'll see that there are still a couple of highlighted areas that have yet to be completed, which is why it still has a status as draft. But we wanted to bring it back to you today just to obviously take you through it or give you the opportunity to ask questions, perhaps identify if you think that there are gaps in it or not, and whether or not this is potentially, a prototype for like a broader communications type strategy. So what we've done with the draft protocol is really looked at, identified, following on from the background and purpose, identified the obligations of each of the relevant agencies that would be involved in an incident. And while I think between ourselves that has always been clear cut, it potentially hadn't been to the members of the public affected in each of those events. And so I think it's important that we put that out there up front about who can do what for them to help them. And then we've looked at the actual actions that would be taken. And I think it's been very timely that Jim's done this presentation, and particularly the last few slides, because certainly arsenic does come under the headline of, or the more along the heading of potential chronic or long-term exposure to it would cause a problem, rather than a high level of E. coli type thing. And the drinking water standard actually recognises that at 10 micrograms per litre of water. And so, in actual fact, the advice that we have around health, a person's health and drinking levels that are contaminated there is quite different from if we get a reading that's, significantly higher. And so what we've done in this case is identified two levels of messaging. One where there is, that potential long-term exposure over up to 70 years if you carry on drinking it, but one where it can become quite acute in a very short time if the level is that high and people keep actually drinking it. And so we've set out the different messaging that we would use, or some of it, as I said, is still in draft. And one of the key things that we've identified there is a decision-making point on which course of action we take lies with the health authorities, because they are the ones actually with the expertise around that. So it's effectively the drinking water assessor in conjunction with the medical officer of health will advise us about which of those courses of action and which type of messaging we would take. And we've also then just done a diagram that really sets out what we've done with the 3 incidences so far, and probably just adding in that a better, a more deliberate communications with all the members of the Joint Drinking Water Group when there is an incident that we're advised of. What we do around then obviously undertaking a risk assessment once we're notified of a finding. We look at things such as the likely source. We look at the potential extent and risk to others in the vicinity to actually try and define the problem. And then that will guide the approach that is taken, whether or not we're just dealing with one householder or a number of them in a physical area, and then our advice to them on what they could or should be doing in terms of addressing the situation. In all 3 cases so far, I think as we've already pointed out to you, the source has been naturally occurring, so there's been no further work to be done in terms of compliance for a potential non-natural source of the contamination. And so for us it's advising people how to manage that situation on an ongoing basis to ensure that their health is provided for, and that really minimising disruption to them, but ensuring that the health risks are reduced or minimised. So Garth, that's probably just it from me. Happy to take questions and feedback as well, clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Open for discussion.
Thank you, Garth. Much appreciated. I really appreciate the approach that's been taken through this paper. I think that's, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, to make sure all the agencies are talking to each other and doing the right thing. The only thing I think that we're missing out of there is a communication strategy to the public. I think one of the challenges we have having so many authorities involved when we have these particular issues is that messaging, the public gets confused as to where the messaging is coming from. I think it would be useful if part of the strategy would be to have a decision made at some point about who was going to be the lead communicator to the public about what's happening, whoever that might be.
I get your point, Councillor. One of the issues that we have had in that situation is that the affected residents don't want the information made public.
Oh, well, you know, I'm not too worried about that as such, and I appreciate that. But when there should be a protocol when there were decisions.
Yes, I think that's part of probably a broader communication strategy about potential waterborne illness incidences. And we'll certainly take that into account as to how we communicate with the public. Thank you.
Thank you.
Liz, I think the point is also communication with this wider group.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, that's.
Sorry. Yeah. It wasn't just the public, and it may not even get into the public arena, but this group should need to.
Sorry, it should be Joint Drinking Water Group and the committee. Yeah, and under that box on that line. Sorry.
Other questions or concerns or comments? I think it does simplify it when you do put the flow diagram like that. It does make it easier for people to understand the steps that will be followed.
One of the things that was discussed when we were working on this, and you raised it, Garth, when you asked Jim a question, but it was around the testing, and that is an issue. We had it can take up to 2 weeks to actually get a result. And you can ask for it under urgency, but even that is not always as quick as some people might want or need it to be. So that's still potentially an issue, but at this stage, that's third party and really out of our hands, except to try and advocate for quick results.
Tom.
Thanks, Gareth. When you get down to that box that has the provisional risk assessment, about 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes down, and then you have messaging at the bottom of that. Is it fair for us to assume that the current agreement is that until there is an agreed message, no one communicates?
No. So what that means is that as soon as we're, if I perhaps just take you through it a little bit, I guess there's an assumption that an exceedance level measure might come from only one well, and we're advised by one landowner, and one of us is, and we advise each of the other agencies as well, and then once we know what that measurement is, and then the medical officer of health or the drinking water assessor will say, oh, this is really high, or else no, we can proceed on this basis that, don't drink it, but it's still okay to water your garden and give it to your animals and stuff like that. So so that's really where we're talking about the type of messaging there. And then once we know the extent of it, then that same messaging would go out to other property owners in the vicinity as well.
Let me re-ask the question. I mean, all I was trying to get at is that if there are multiple parties involved in this assessment process, because you have the DHB involved, you have a district staff people involved, regional people, until all of those folks are agreed, is there an understanding that no one is going to go off and put out a press release saying?
Oh yes, sorry,
that's
yes,
all I was asking.
yes, yeah, I get you now. Yep, yeah, no, so that's right. Then perhaps we should add that in. I think somewhere that there'll be have to be collective agreement on any broad public messaging.
Which at the end of the day was what I was trying to drive at too as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
It's fair to say, Liz, that the wider communication protocol is still being worked on.
Yep.
It hasn't been finalised, and certainly I've invited different people, and anyone that would like to contribute, they should feel free to email Liz with their views. But there is a draft wider communication protocol being drafted for this group about how we do exactly that. At what point does this group get known, and when does it go wider? And if it's an urgent one, then it's going to have to bypass this. It'll just be most probably a communique from the medical officer of health. So there's a number of things in that wider communication protocol that's been considered.
Yeah, no, great. Looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Certainly it was, it's been taken on board. We haven't got it to this point to bring it today, but it's being worked on in the background.
Yep, that's fine.
If there's no further comment in terms of that, then would someone like to move that the protocol as presented be approved? Thank you, Sandra. Seconder. Moving on to the next item, which is the tank plan change, the drinking water provisions. Craig, do you want to do? I'm just thinking. I'm just thinking that Craig, you might want to throw your slides up if that was convenient at this stage. Craig did present to the tank group and does cover source protection zones, and I know we've talked about them already, and Jim alluded to them, but I think it would be handy to understand what the concept of those for this wider group and the impact in terms of that tank process. And then I'll get Rena to take us through the actual update.
Yep.
So I'll just jump to the maps. I'll skip all the other background stuff. I'm going to run through all of that stuff. So just quickly, actually there's probably one slide just to give context. Jump around a bit. So GNS a number of years ago has developed some draft guidelines around how a water supplier might look to calculate what a source protection zone area, a 1 year zone. They talk about three key areas. One is source protection zone 1, which is the very highly proximate to a bore head or the water intake of a surface water. This stuff in front of you is primarily around so out of the bore. Source protection zone 2, which is around picking up the wider area, and as Jim talked about topically earlier, that 1 year protection on the basis that microbiological issues, largely there's a level of dieback. And then there's the whole, what is the catch area? So where is the total catchment coming from? So we've been doing quite a lot of work working with Tonkin and Taylor, using the GNS guidelines, but also from US EPA around how they go about working it through. And there is a continuum around working out how you do the calculation of a very defined source protection zone, right down very much to a desktop level, heading through some manual methods. The approach we've taken, which has a high level of sophistication, and then there's a level above that we tried, but unfortunately the level of sophistication and granularity doesn't exist quite yet, where we would be able to go into the massive amount of work that's gone into the tank hydraulic model. In time, we would hope to be able to use that highly computational model to provide even more detail. But the model we've had is based on the US EPA GNS guidelines and has been peer reviewed by Kath Moore from GNS, who's the, probably the leading knowledge-based person. So from a Hastings, we've done a lot of work working out what those zones are. So here's the centre of Hastings, Flaxmere. Those bores there are what we call our Eastbourne field, so there are 5 bores. They provide predominant amount of, pretty much, aside from Brookvale 3 with its treatment, they provide all the water to Havelock North and a large proportion of Hastings. Frimley, and that has a zone, Wilson Road and Flaxmere, and Portsmouth. So just to simplify the picture, I'll just jump here to the end. What zone does it cover? So from a Hastings perspective, that is the source protection zone of 1 year travel underground. So that's the water taking a year under full pumping rate, so that would be us pumping at the maximum consented allowance. What does that look like? It also had to take into account Watties take a lot of water out of the ground as well, so we don't all live in a bubble, and it's the combined effects that we need to understand, not all are just individual effects. So for Eastbourne Street, it's quite a large area. Frimley, because the hydraulic properties and transmissivities underground get a slightly different shape, and that's very highly shown by Wilson Road and Portsmouth Road. Highly transmissive, gravels flow through, and slightly smaller take, but less big takes around it. So for a source protection zone for these areas, that would be an area where we're wanting to have particular regard and having a higher level of oversight and understanding of activities going inside it. Those boundaries, Kath Moore at GNS has asked for some further sensitivity analysis around what if the direction of water flow in the aquifer was different, and we've just received some draft maps back recently. It doesn't change these ones very much, but it widens these ones out. So there's a discussion to have how reasonable it is to have a 30% change in water direction. In terms of the tank planes stuff that Rena will work through, what we've recognised is not everyone is going to have the capacity and the time to be able to define a very detailed assessment on itself. So what the plan talks about, under the Health Act, there's the Director General of Health has a register of drinking water supplies. There are scheduled supplies and then other set ones. So what we did for the tank plan change area, but ultimately it would play through in a wider plan change to other areas, is at the moment with a default 2 kilometre circle, that's what putting 2 kilometre circles around every registered drinking water supply in the tank catchment looks like. And the plan change talks about affording similar type of considerations for a supply that feeds a school, a supply that feeds a Māori who have taken the option to join into that register. It looks quite busy because it's got all the urban ones on there. If we take out the big municipals of Hastings and Napier, working on the facts, so here's the Hastings ones at Eastbourne, Frimley, Portsmouth, and that's how it looks on the map. And here's the ones who haven't got a fully defined zone but would look to have some definition. The Joint Working Group and Tank, we all talked about the need just to have a little bit more thought around that default zone because it's not perfectly circular, and is there a slightly better start point? That's probably enough.
No, thanks, Craig, for just giving a wider appreciation of what those source protection zones look like. So, Rena, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Namahi koutou. Yeah, so I won't belabour the point about the tank group and its work. Suffice to say it has been going for 6 years, and RPC received a draft of the plan change yesterday and has been working through it. The JWG was tasked by the tank group to come back to it with some recommended rules, policies and objectives around the protection of drinking water. Quite a big task. So the JWG contracted an entity called Good Earth Matters, who've got extensive experience with the RMA and drinking water issues, and also the Hawke's Bay context. So there has been quite a significant amount of work that's been done by Good Earth Matters, the JWG, and the tank project team. But just to sort of run you through what GEM were tasked with doing, they were asked to assess the current regulatory framework, consider the use of source protection zones, stock take risk activities within the tank catchment, which kind of goes to Jim's presentation earlier, where he stressed, being really clear about those risk activities. And then, of course, developing a draft framework of objectives, policies and rules. And, just to really re-emphasise that there has been considerable discussion between the JWG, Tank and Good Earth Matters in progressing this. So Tank met on the 27th of July, and the JWG recommended to Tank that an objective be included which explicitly recognise source protection zones, and underpinning that several rules for activities that already required a resource consent, adding matters of control that enable the drinking water risks to drinking water sources to be considered, and of course that's pivotal to the source protection zones that Craig just discussed. Amendments to existing permitted activity rules so they meet the requirements of the National Environmental Standard for Sources of Human Drinking Water, and also production land use and source protection zones to be permitted activities, but farm environment plans which have been picked up in the tank plan change, and also a key factor in the Tuki catchment as well, will need to include consultation with the Water Supply Authority and identify measures to manage risks. So the tank group supported those recommendations. However, they are subject to some technical refinement which is going on at present between the JWG tank project team and Good Earth Matters, such as what Craig talked about, which is really nailing down that default radius, and there's also some other sort of minor technical matters to be resolved as well. The next JWG meeting is on the 24th of August, so we will be traversing those issues at length there and coming to a resolution on those. But that's really all I've got to update you on. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Garth. God, this is like, sound like a broken record. A couple of questions. 8.3.1, for activities that require resource consent, I take that also, that includes not only new applicants but also people that are rolling over or reapplying for their consent takes?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. So when it says there, enable the risk of drinking water sources to be considered, does that mean to me, it means, well, excuse my ignorance, but does that mean that the applicant will have to evidence that what their intended use isn't going to affect drinking water sources? They have to include that as part of their evidence to all their submission for consent?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, that's cool. 8.3.4, how much legal standing would having the source production zone and then farm environment plans, how much legal standing does that have in terms of us able to, or the regional council, or whichever council it is, being able to enforce some sort of, or making sure that that particular land use is not affecting the drinking water supply in the recharge zone?
The farm environment plans will be a statutory requirement under the Plan Change 9, the tank plan change, as they are under Plan Change 6. So the content of those will also be specified in the plan as well. And the key reason for using this as a tool is to allow the water supply authorities, in this case Napier City Council and Hastings District Council, requiring the landowner to discuss with them what activities are occurring on their land if they're in the source protection zone.
Yep.
And what they are doing to mitigate the effects, as you've described, of those activities on groundwater quality.
Okay, so leading on from that, I assume then that part of the plan change is that that information is able to be provided to the relative territorial authorities?
It'll be included in the farm environment plan, yep.
So, because I know we had a challenge with plan change such for the availability of plan of farm environmental plans to the regional council. So I assume that's been tweaked in terms of what's okay. Now the other question I'm following on from that, we're talking about farm environmental plans, but as you can see from the map, there's a fair amount of recharge zone that sits over, for example, industrial and residential areas. How are we going to capture those particular landowners?
So I can speak to one activity in particular, such as stormwater. So the stormwater rules will require activities that are a high risk, a commercial or industrial activity to provide. There'll be an assessment by decision makers to see whether or not they sit over a source protection zone, and that will determine what their activity status will be.
I'm sorry, I'm struggling with them. That to me sounds inequitable in terms of we're expecting farming landowners to provide us with a farm environmental plan with some sort of how they're going to deal with that issue. Yet we're making an assessment on a particular industrial zones. Why are not industrial landowners being asked to provide some sort of assurance to the public that they're not doing exactly the same sort of, they're not putting their drinking water supplies at risk?
Sorry.
Through the chair, if I could respond to that. Napier City Council, as I'm sure Hastings District Council, are doing a lot of work around stormwater quality at present, and that is growing in terms of our efforts. I could talk to our consent for the Thames Time catchment and the requirement to develop a catchment management plan for that area. That consent has conditions in it where we have to assess the risk of all of the properties in that catchment for discharge contaminants either to ground or to stormwater, and we follow that up with the requirement for them to produce an environmental management plan that identifies and assesses their own risks and identifies how they're going to manage and control those risks. And the idea there is that they must implement that to comply with our stormwater bylaw and our trade rights bylaw. Now those bylaws both need strengthening to better enable us to push that message through, but we're working on that for the Thames Time catchment, and that's the intent of our resource consent application for our West Shore Tollgate consent that we share with Hawke's Bay Regional Council for that much greater catchment area across Napier.
I'm sorry, I'm not just considering the Thames Tyne Street. I have to consider the whole region because
responding to your question about how we might require those industries to assess and control their own risks of contamination.
Okay, because what I want is the assurance that somehow we're not going to have another firefighting foam incident happen in the Hawke's Bay, because that's, the Hawke is not a farming system. That's an industrial type. I assume it's an industrial zone, but if you know what I mean, I want to be assured that the plan change is enough to capture all that.
So I think, Paul, there's two sort of types, if you like, of the situation you've talked about. One is where, as John's probably described, where an industrial site is linked to a reticulated supply, and I think that's dealt with by the respective TAs. And the other, which I think is probably more your concern lies, is if it's not connected to one of those. And so as part of the tank plan change, there are amendments to current rules in the RRMP around discharges to land that may enter water, and that includes anything that's in a source protection zone is not permitted, it's discretionary, and we have to have a look at it. So I think that would cover, the intent anyway is that would cover the situation that you're concerned about, and particularly the inequity that any industrial activity, if it's not linked to a reticulated system, will need a consent from us. They'll need to if they're in the source protection zone, they will need to describe how they're going to address any risks to groundwater quality.
Cool, that was all I was after.
Yeah, in the case of those consented activities in the source protection zone, are there maximum contaminant levels specified as part of those consents? And if they are, how are they going to be monitored?
No, they're not. I don't think, Kevin, there are. Yeah, that's probably something for the person that's written the plan change. But I can't recall seeing any. Yeah.
I think we should get some information on that.
Yep.
Moving forward.
I think in that vein, it's worth noting that in the discussion yesterday at the Joint Planning Committee, which is halfway through a review of the tank process, this area is the one that generated, I guess, the most concern on the part of the members of the Joint Planning Committee, regional plan, whatever it's called, Joint Planning Committee. The concern being that a lot of attention has been put on farmers, growers, and the implication of their activities on safe drinking water, whereas a number of folks on that committee felt that the treatment of other sources, industrial and municipal and so forth, were sort of treated with a lighter hand. I think the takeaway of the meeting yesterday was that the staff was asked to rethink some of these provisions to address that concern, see if there were other things that needed to be included in the plan if there was a determination that there was some inequality of treatment, as it were, that everybody was being held to pretty significant standards and timelines, because one of the things that was absent really with respect to things like stormwater were timelines, whereas farmers, growers, and so forth under the proposed plan change are subject to pretty rigorous timelines and standards. So more to come in that space, I would say.
Through you, Chair.
Yes.
Just to follow on from what Tom has said, I mean, source protection zones with the change to the national water standards is certainly going to be included. I mean, there's no question about that. So while this is a great start and a very, very important start with a plan change, we're going to be looking at national standards that are going to change, and source protection is going to have a huge input and be part of those water standard changes. So you know, this is absolutely key that we're doing this work, and this is as I said, a fantastic start. We know that our environment has huge impact on safe drinking water, delivery of safe drinking water, but we have to be prepared for the next stage. This is just the beginning.
Cool. I think in the light of some of the comments around what may be missing, one of the areas that the Joint Working Group has decided to do more work on is septic tank in source protection zones that don't currently require consents or haven't been built in a period where the new consenting process has required sort of a higher standard. And so it would be remiss for this group not to be aware that there is still a group of activities that aren't going to be captured by the current recommendations, but it's an area that's been identified for further work by the JWG. So just so you're aware that there is some gaps in terms of the recommendations, and certainly the Joint Working Group have identified that and is proposing a work stream that will follow up on it.
So probably through you, Chair, just sort of building on to this morning's meeting where that was discussed, we also discussed there was just a couple of pieces from the recommendations that didn't quite make it through to what the regional Planning Committee is working through. In particular, the joint working groups and the discussions we're going to carry on was around the explicit objective. It got to make it fit with the rest of the picture, it's got melded into other things, and the group feels that it's not explicit enough to send those messages in that policy and rule setting context across all of those things, be it productive land, be it industrial land. And I guess just to pick up on the earlier comment around the industrial sites are definitely not out of anyone's target, and plugging that gap that we've had in the existing framework of the industrial sites that were living on their own and finding ways through the existing planning framework is a massive step forward for all of that. And through our bylaw, building on John's comment, our bylaw and stuff, we're working right through and have already been working through all the site assessments of high and medium risk through those catchments. So basically industrial sites will need to do exactly what a farm plan does, but for the industrial sites. But it's not just this plan change, it's what does each council do with their district plan around activity controls. It's what do we do around, so under the Local Government Act, the territorial authorities have an obligation to do what's called sanitary assessments. It was a thing that was very busy 15 odd years ago, and they detuned that you didn't have to update them. Given the learnings and given obviously all the stuff you've heard from Jim, the environment, those plans need to be reassessed with new eyes, wider open and less assumptions than were nationally consistent. And that might see a whole pile of changes around some of the proliferation of septic tanks in relatively dense urban areas. So I don't think there's one bullet and this one item isn't going to help do all of the things, but it's definitely useful in a step journey.
Any further comment? Sorry.
Thanks, Carl. Just catch up, I suppose. Having heard the first presentation this morning, do we have Barrier 1, which is the catchment? I'm looking at the catchment source, and Barrier 2, I'd assume, would be the FEMPs. These protected zones are protecting the aquifers that feed the water sources. Is that this Barrier 3?
I think maybe I'll try answering that, Nahewi. Under the multi-barrier approach, the Barrier 1 is the source protection zone, and Jim spent quite a bit of time sort of talking about that, and then you'll recall he said, and equally a huge amount needs to be put into the next barrier, which is once the water gets into the reticulation system. So it's basically source protection, treatment and distribution are the three, if you like, barriers or opportunities for intervention to ensure that the drinking water quality is as high as it can be.
Running upstream, though, is there that catchment source barrier? Is there one? Have we gone that far upstream?
So I'll go back to the picture, but under the normal, Liz is bang on, normally that catchment area, as you're referencing, is termed Barrier 1. If I go back to one of these, which maybe have a bigger...
The map.
So this is just the Eastbourne Street bore. These are a whole pile of different sensitivity analysis. So that's that 1 year collection zone, which is the microbiological. Then that's the aquifer catchment zone back to the recharge. And then, as you said, there's the river system. And from a risk assessment, what contaminants or points of interest exist? Is there something that is persistent and never dies off? So the work we did with Tonkin and Taylor, we also looked at chemicals. Apart from one, and I can't remember what, TCE, nickel, Brett, what does... On the chemical loads, TCE, there was one that lasts longer than 1 year, but most of the chemical issues dissipated in groundwater within a year. So from a drinking water view, the 1 year covers 90-odd%. Viruses now has moved from a 1 year view to maybe a 2, maybe a bit longer, and that's going to have significant potential effects if that's proven for domestic wastewater systems, septic tanks, particularly where you have a well, a septic tank, a well, a septic tank, that scenario, which we all have. So it is, you have to do the full assessment around that catchment and what are the activities. As an example, we have obviously the old Roy's Hill. So right around Roy's Hill, we have monitoring that goes on, firstly for our resource consent, but we've also had, we've asked Tonkin and Taylor working for us to, okay, here's a whole pile of metrics that we were managing from an environmental stuff, but tell me what else we might need to know that we may not have been looking at 2.5 years ago to monitor, because that's a potential source.
Yeah.
Things happen there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just to add to that, I don't think we should pretend we're actually doing what's being done in Holland or Denmark, taking the animals out of our source protection zone. Let's be honest. There will still be animals in these source protection zones. What we're doing is saying that there are certain very high risk activities where we want you to come to us and prove that you're not going to increase the risk.
Thank you.
Other questions? If not, then the recommendations and taking on board the view that there is still further work, though, being asked by the planning or joint planning group.
Garth, I would assume that this topic would be a recurring till the tank...
till it actually gets approved.
Right.
Yeah. Was the timing for the tank notification
Early 2019.
Yeah, so there'll still be
Fun times ahead.
yeah. The recommendations are before you. Would someone like to move accordingly? Just noting, though, that there is likely further work in that second subgroup, subsection.
Happy to move. Go.
Put the recommendation. We'll say it. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. It's Rena again on the update of the joint working group.
Yes, so as you're all aware, the Joint Working Group has a work plan that it works through when we meet. Some of the things on that work plan are from the panel of inquiry, and we've been working our way through those for the last 18 months. At the last meeting, the committee directed the Joint Working Group to go away and prioritise the actions. So we have done that. As you will see, probably a couple of things that I'd like to, draw to attention is, as you all know, the tank work has been the main priority of the group. We've been working to really tight timeframes dictated to us by the tank project team, and this has meant that while we have been progressing our other actions in the background, it's really been the tank action that's been the main priority for the group. So we've given you an update on that. The other key point that was raised at the last meeting was around the comms work, and Liz updated on the arsenic protocol, and we are very much looking to use that as a prototype for the wider comms plan that is being developed and progressed in the background. As I've already touched on, the next JWG meeting is on the 24th, and we will be going through our action plan and updating the actions and progressing as status quo, or as business as usual, I should say. But happy to take any questions, comments on that.
Shocked me. You can always look in this corner, Garth. Hey, thank you for the paper. I appreciate it. Communications, which is box number 2, I think. Development of common terminology. Can you? Is that someone, one group of engineers talking Chinese and the other group of engineers talking German?
Yeah, it's very much around one thing that came out of some of the work we did that looked at our information gaps and information sharing was making sure that when we are communicating issues to the public, we're using the same terminology around some of the risks or some of the issues. So
Yep.
Just making sure we're clear in what we're saying outwardly.
Yep. And the second one on page 8, bottom of page 18, development of risk management approach through water safety plans. You've got in there the priorities are medium.
Yep.
The water safety plans have been actively developed. Have you given yourself any time frame for completion or something to come back to this group?
I might just ask our TLA reps to update on their water safety plans. It's probably better coming from them.
Craig, are you able to do Hastings?
Yeah, so well, we all under legislation need to work through water safety plans. The intent of that item was to, at successive meetings, each TA to present the key risks and the key things that they were actioning through their water safety plans on the basis that one entity might be looking at some risks in a unique way that another entity may not have thought about it. So it was around sharing and populating tools. So as Serena's already talked to, there's been a significant focus on working through on that source protection zone work and the communication protocol. My understanding of previous discussion was we would just set up a schedule, so not the next meeting because that's already got one meeting after the other. So Hawke's Bay will talk through where their status is, Wairoa will talk through theirs, we will talk through ours, John and his team will talk through theirs. Just as actually keeping it at a high level. There are a number of other groups that are working together at a slightly operational level that the DHB through Marie have been doing, and that's having a lot more operational, tactile discussion with operators and stuff. This was more at the higher level. Are we thinking about risks? How are we approaching it? We've found something that might be transferable and recyclable for someone else. So the process was very much a sharing, collaboration and learnings one. So I envisage after that 28th, each subsequent meeting, each of us would do a brief presentation and share.
Okay, thanks for that. That explains it all to me. Just to point out or make a comment that in terms of the action plan that we've got here, the use of the word development of risk, the use of the word development implies to me that something's being put together, which is, if we're going to develop something, we should have a time frame on it. But obviously that's not quite the case here, so maybe that's just a misuse that word that raised that for me.
Okay. That's a good point. We'll take that on board.
Central Hawke's Bay District Council is represented on this committee, right?
Yes.
Could someone refresh me as to the terms of reference in that much of this work plan and what we discuss here has to do with water safety, the quality of water and so forth. Does our portfolio include security of supply? And the reason I ask that question is that we have a controversy brewing in terms of whether parts of Central Hawke's Bay have adequate drinking water and who is responsible for ensuring that they do if they do not. And is that a suitable topic for us to hear about, be reported on, or is that outside the orbit of this committee?
It's quantity as well.
Yeah.
Have to go back to the terms of reference. Yeah,
It was quantity
right.
and quality.
Yeah.
So I would ask, I mean, we seem to have a situation brewing where the public would look at it and say, 2 years after an outbreak, let's say in Havelock North, we're still arguing over who's responsible for what here. And now we have a situation where there are 200 households in Central Hawke's Bay who can't regularly access drinking water, and some local government officials are saying it's the district's territorial authorities' problem to deal with and make sure those folks are dealt with. And other folks are saying, well, wait a minute, you guys who regulate the aquifer and give away the water from the aquifer have some responsibility for whether or not water supply is being met. And so we are about to have a public brouhaha over who's on first base here. Yep. Is this a body that should try to arbitrate such matters.
From my recollection,
Could we get a
terms of
report on the
reference clearly
subject?
said both quality and quantity.
Absolutely. We debated that. Yep.
And I'd have no hesitation in saying that should be included.
Yes.
We're the same people from one end to the other. So what benchmarks we have for one should be right.
So I raise it at this juncture because if it's in our orbit, then I would say there ought to be some
Work stream
work stream. And I mean, from the regional council standpoint, we do have an agenda item at the next Environment Committee meeting, which will be in early September. And of course, we're going to hear our staff's point of view on this subject. But it probably bears wider scrutiny by someone. This would be the right group, I think.
So just seeking clarity then, would you prefer that we not present on the 5th of September but bring it back to this committee?
I don't know. I mean, institutional behavior being what it is, I suspect that our staff is going to come forward and say it's their problem. So I suspect we're not going to be told that we've over-allocated water in the Ruatanipa Basin and it's going to the wrong people, and maybe we should reconsider that. I doubt that that's what we're going to hear.
I mean, the thing that we don't want to do is have to duplicate workload, so it'd be good to get direction on where we should be taking it.
Thanks, Liz. Did you
I
want
was going
to?
to suggest that I've already tabled it as an agenda item for the next JWG meeting, so that might be a forum that could look at it initially and then come back to this group.
It's certainly within the terms of reference, and I've just had them pulled up. So it's certainly within our brief to look at it, and taking the directive from this group that.
When is this group next meet?
24th.
The JWD,
the governance group.
The
governance group
committee.
is the next meetings, and I haven't said a date.
But certainly not before September 6th.
No.
I'm eager to get our report. Just chug along.
You need to keep going.
Fun and
Needs to
games.
come back here.
So on that basis, we will develop, as a recommendation from this group to the working group, to develop a work stream into that work program, looking at quantity as well as quality. Any other queries on the paper or the work plan? No? Could someone move that it be received and noted? Seconder? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. The last item on the agenda, it's not an agenda item as such, but I understand, was it the Mayor's Forum met earlier, and I understand Wayne's going to summarise the outcome
We'll
of that.
start off with an overview and then Wayne can do detail, but me, Little and I will speak to where we've got to. Start and you just carry on, or you start.
You do the overview.
So the mayors and chair of the region have been giving a great deal of thought in terms of the changes that are occurring, because we've heard from the government on now 3 occasions in Wellington that the status quo of the way we're delivering drinking water won't stay the same. So they are preparing local government around the country that there's going to be significant change following the stage 2 of the inquiry. So we had a meeting last week with Minister Mahuta, the Minister of Local Government, after our Water Summit meeting that we all attended in Wellington, to consider how we could as a region deliver the 3 waters, which is likely to be the changes that the government are going to make. So the 3 waters: drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. So we held a meeting last week with her. She flew in to talk to us. Wayne presented a paper of how this could look, and then we will and talk to her about a 17-day review under the way we are delivering these waters at the moment. And given that, you know, we're all interconnected, share same aquifers, and how we're doing what we're doing is, you know, could we look at other models? So like the Wellington water model, or where all the whole region of Wellington work under a model to deliver safe drinking water and the other two waters. So she was very interested, given that they have done huge investigation. They've just taken a DIA group to the UK, Scotland and Ireland to look at the way they regulate their waters and deliver drinking water, etc. They went into Europe, and so they're looking at other models around the world. And so we considered we wanted to be proactive and say, could government co-fund a review on our water? So then Wayne put together a paper for discussion and a presentation to her, and she was very, very interested in following that up. So that is just for information really at this stage, but it is for us to be proactive as a region. Before it's delivered to us, how can we see another way? So Wayne, over to you. Or me little, did you want to say anything?
Just a little bit. Just regional Hawke's Bay is a good cross-sectional area of how we do waters, and Waira is obviously a lot different than the rest of Hawke's Bay because we get ours out of the river, we don't get it out of an aquifer. And we've been testing and we've been chlorinating our water for many years. So, and of course, where do you stop and start with this? How far do you go into a water system? Do you go into Raupanga, where Charlie's just put in a new scheme in his little town? And so, yeah, so there's a lot to look into.
Wayne.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's sort of just carrying on from what Mayor Hazelhurst was saying. I guess it was really the opportunity to be a lot more proactive in terms of what the government's trying to do around the review into three waters, and particularly because one part of that review is looking at the aggregation of water suppliers and how that could be delivered across New Zealand. So sort of being in charge of your own destiny. She was particularly pleased with Hawke's Bay taking a proactive approach to that, and she made a lot of comments around that. We focused a lot around the objectives as to what could be delivered by taking this approach. So really focusing on what our customers' needs are, looking at the capacity and capability issues across the region. Interesting, the infrastructure teams have been working very closely as well. They've also had discussions with Tararua. And Tararua are interested in being involved in this review process as well because they can see some synergies with them. We'll also have some discussions elsewhere. But what we do want to do is make sure that we any sort of structure process that we come up with doesn't compete against our council's priorities. You know, we do recognise, for instance, that Hastings has a huge water program. So how can you come up with a structure that can ensure that those priorities, your community's priorities, are met, at the same time delivering a lot more efficiency and effectiveness in how you deliver that service. So looking at things like economies of scale, flexibility. Obviously, one of the things that the government is very keen to address is they believe that there is a significant financial gap in how infrastructure is going to be managed into the future. And so how would a structure here, a model here, address some of those issues? They think that you can only achieve that by taking...
Okay, I found...
Be quiet, Siri. They think you can only achieve that by
taking... the minister approving the proposal.
Taking aggregation to an extremely high level. So they want to look at that. The one which was a little interesting, she made a comment, was because they're sending a very clear message that there needs to be a change to the regulatory framework in terms of how water is regulated, because it is done by a number of different entities. And we thought that they had sort of were looking at a particular path that they were going down. She would like us to put that into the review and see how that could be managed on a regional basis as well. So she's it seems the government are very open to looking at how we do it. So in terms of going forward, I've had discussions now with DIA officials, so they're going to work with us in developing up the terms of reference. Once the terms of reference are established for the review, we'll take them back to all the councils and to government to get signed off. They'll also need to probably go to council in full, just so that it's fully clear. We're looking at basically doing a Section 17A business case review process for it. The Minister sort of mentioned a time frame of around about starting it in October to line up with the government budget cycles, because we are going to ask government for funding to help achieve this. And then it'll be a process going through, doing the review, checking the options. There'll have to be some consultation that occurs around it. But she did quite like the timeline that we had established for this.
I, for one, am delighted to see another area where amalgamation by stealth is on the table. Seriously, it's commendable to me that the Hastings Council, the Napier Council, all the councils in their last long-term plans have made substantial funding commitments to deal with water infrastructure, huge commitments, and from a regional council standpoint, the importance of that is from the lens we look through is in terms of protecting effects of pollution in our water systems, whether it's health or ecologically based. And so part of what we're trying to deal with in the tank situation is how do you get everybody moving forward against a common set of objectives where these kinds of investments are needed. You can do so much in a plan change that sets standards and other ground rules and so forth, but if it's not matched by an investment in the infrastructure needed to provide safe, secure water, then we're just kidding ourselves. So any process that gets us on the same path and in time frames so that in one part of the community it doesn't appear that we are lagging in our commitment to providing safe drinking water, and another part of the community is making huge investment and getting on with it. I think we're a group that's supposed to represent all of Hawke's Bay, and it seems to me part of our mission ought to be able to credibly say to all of our residents that they're going to have equal access to safe water. The mandate of this committee is strictly drinking water, I guess, but all the other benefits of safe, secure water as well. So I guess this will ultimately reach beyond drinking water. This will
Three waters.
Be everything. So it's not just us that's at issue, but it sounds great to me.
Yeah, thank you, Garth. Yes, well, I still tend to agree with Councillor Belford that it's great to see all the different authorities acting in cooperation around this particular issue, because I think that's where the community kind of really wants us to be. I'm curious to know...
Is that a pro-amalgamation statement?
No, not quite. Getting close though, Tom. I'm really curious to know at what stage are we intending to, or would you be intending to engage with the community as to around to what the thoughts are and what this new structure is intended to be looking like, and who's actually going to communicate that? Is that going to be something that's going to come from the Mural and Chair Forum, or is that going to be something that's going to come from this group, or is it going to come from wherever?
None of that's been decided yet, so we just need to undertake the work first. I mean, if you look at capacity and resourcing for a start, so Hastings now employs, is it 25, Brett? 25. So in Hastings alone, Hastings District Council employs 25 people in the water team since the Havelock North water contamination. And you look at, and that expertise comes not just from New Zealand, it comes we've had to bring people in from Australia and around the country, because these are experts. They don't just sit around sort of, being available. So you just think of that part alone and how you could share that capacity and resource. So there's a lot of work to do, Paul. There's no answers yet. It's like that, and we just need to sort of see how it's going to. But in the meantime, we will undertake getting an independent person to have a look at how we could work together as a region.
Yeah, because at the end of the day,
Sorry, Wayne.
this particular issue is now out in public. It's all on video. So we either get ahead of the game and set down where our thoughts are, or where our thoughts are on where we're heading, or we allow the public to perhaps take it over, take control of that messaging from us. So we've got two choices in that respect, and we need to think about how we're going to manage that particular issue.
Yeah, just further to that and what Mayor Hazelhurst was saying, I guess one of the key messages is that in terms of the ownership of the infrastructure, the clear direction from government is that they want it to remain in public ownership. And I think that's probably one of the key messages which the community needs to understand. We're not talking about a change in ownership of that. We're talking about how we manage the delivery of the service. And so the consultation part will really come once you start to understand what the options, and so you'll need to get that feedback and engagement occurring there. But one of the key messages which needs to be obviously taken out is that we're not talking about a change in ownership to water.
Which is fine. I totally get that, Wayne. That's cool. But that's the message we need to get out there before the public starts to imagine things that are going to perhaps not happen.
So through you, Chair, can I just... this is a directive from the government. This isn't. This is something that we are taking as a proactive measure, because the government have told us on 3 occasions now, in water forums in Wellington, that status quo, and the local government conference, you heard it too, Paul. That status quo isn't going to. We're not going to remain the same the way we're delivering drinking water in New Zealand. So they're looking at other models. They've given us, at local government, you saw they put some things up of how this could look, and we're actually saying, well, let's do some work ourselves, and so we can go back to them and work with them.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh,
yeah.
Just to wind it back a bit, though, when the iwi and Hapu took Hastings District Council to the Environmental Court some 10, 12, 15 years ago, from that emerged the Hastings Tangata Whenua Joint Committee on Wastewater. But that joint committee also advocated that there should be the 3 waters from way back then. So ad nauseum, they said it should be 3 waters, not just 1 water. So there's a genesis of that kaupapa already on some of our tables.
Yes.
And we should use it to generate speed on it.
Yes.
Not wait for the government to do it.
No, and that's what we're doing.
Because just relating, there was a move to widen the terms of reference of this group to 3 waters, and that was resisted initially because of the Havelock inquiry and making sure we nailed the outcomes of that process through the working group. But again, that's part of the consideration that the different representative groups will need to consider again at some point in time. And how this group engages with that work stream that would need to be done, that's something that I'm sure will be considered and communicated. Any other questions of Sandra or Wayne or me a little regarding that? If not, appreciate everybody's input today. And again, thank you very much for your attendance.
Well, thank you, everybody. Mate atu e mata, mate atu e tama, mate atu e waru tapu, tātai katoa, e tiaki, nanaki, e arataki i tēnei rā, haumea, huia, tai. Kia ora.